straight to Chief Foreign Correspondent Trey Yingst. He is live in Tel Aviv with the latest. Trey, tell us what is happening in this high-stakes negotiation and appeal to Iran.
Yeah, guys, good morning. Reports indicate that Iran has responded to the U.S. peace proposal to end the war, giving their response to Pakistani mediators. Now, initial reports in Iranian state media indicate their response focuses on ending the war and ensuring security in the Strait of Hormuz. There is no mention of Iran's nuclear program, a key agenda item for the Trump administration. Now, this comes as we're also tracking reports of a cargo ship that was targeted off the coast of Qatar earlier today. We understand an unknown projectile hit the vessel that was 23 nautical miles northeast of Doha. That, according to the UK Maritime Agency. The explosion caused a small fire that is now under control, according to reports. The incident, though, highlighting the latest in a series of events in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz that show Iran is testing the fragile ceasefire.
From our perspective, a naval blockade is considered a military act, and a military act receives a military response. Let them understand this. From now on, they should assign several additional escorts to their destroyers so that if one of them starts sinking, they can at least rescue and evacuate their naval forces.
With the region waiting to see the details of this Iranian response, President Trump shared a series of AI images overnight depicting Iran's Navy at the bottom of the sea. President Trump was asked over the weekend about the expected Iranian response, saying this.
Do you think they're slow-rolling it? Do you think they're intentionally slow-rolling the process?
We'll find out soon enough.
This hour, we're also tracking developments of Iranian drones over both the UAE and Kuwait, an indication Iran is continuing its attacks against Gulf countries. Guys?
Yeah, Trey, so this response coming, do we know who is sending this? Is this coming from Khamenei or Parliament? Who's sending this message? What can you tell us about what's happening inside Iran?
What's interesting is late last week, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian indicated for the first time publicly that he had met directly for more than 2 hours with Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. And there was also an interesting post from state media this morning, and I want to pull it up for you. It's from a top reporter inside of Iran saying Lieutenant General Abdullahi, in a meeting with His Eminence Ayatollah Sayyid Mojtaba Khamenei, presented a report on the preparedness of Iran's armed forces, encompassing the Army, the IRGC, law enforcement, security, and border guard forces, the Ministry of Defense, and the heroic Basij. This is an indication that the Iranians are trying to signal that if this response to the mediators in Pakistan and ultimately the Trump administration is not sufficient, that they are prepared if this leads to a resumption of the bombing campaign, which would also see an increase of attacks by Iranian forces. And so Iran is signaling that they are prepared to return to war. The question now is what was in this response presented to Pakistani mediators and whether or not it is going to address the key issue that President Trump cares about, and that is ensuring that Iran never has a nuclear weapon.
Trey, let me ask you about the Israeli response. Obviously, because we're just getting information that it was sent to Pakistani mediators, they may not have all the information. What, if anything, can you tell us about what's coming from Bibi Netanyahu and his team?
The Israelis are bracing for the reality that if these negotiated settlement attempts fail, the region could imminently return to war, which would include missile fire toward Israel. But we're also tracking other developments as it relates to Iranian proxies across the region, like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And I spoke earlier today with a senior advisor to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Michael Eisenberg, who said this about efforts to disarm Hamas inside Gaza.
I'm very optimistic about President Trump and the Board of Peace. I think they are the first administration and the first institution that very clearly sees Hamas for who they are. And they very clearly assess the situation for what it is. Hamas for who they are, unrepentant, non-compliant terrorists who we gave a chance to bring along the rest of the world and the mediators. They also see that Gaza, without a total remake, without getting rid of Hamas, without getting rid of the weapons, is never going to provide a better life for the people.
The bottom line here is that advisors to Israel's prime minister indicate they believe in President Trump. They think he is clear-eyed when it comes to not only the threats from inside Gaza, but also from Iran's largest proxy, Hezbollah, in southern Lebanon, and, of course, from the Iranian regime itself. Guys?
You know, Trey, it's very clear that President Trump wants to get what he wants out of Iran, which is for them to denuclearize, but also wants to wrap this up. There are a lot of domestic concerns he must be thinking about. We've been talking earlier, the map definitely has moved more in their favor in terms of seats, but I think he would definitely like to see gas prices lower, something that the country would like as well. So what is the indication that you're getting from the administration? I know a couple weeks ago you were on the phone with the president. I know you have a lot of sources. How anxious are they to get this deal done? And how much does the upcoming trip to China play into that?
It's a great question. I've talked to President Trump a number of times throughout this war and during a very challenging time for the region. And the president seems quite clear-eyed on what the objective is of Operation Epic Fury, and that is to ensure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. Because when we think back to the negotiations that were happening before this operation began, the Iranians came to the negotiating table and they told U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff that they had enough highly enriched uranium to create 11 nuclear bombs. And this was a signal to President Trump that, A, not only were the Iranians prepared to pursue a nuclear weapon, but B, they had the capability to do so. And so the president has very much presented this to the world, and especially the American people, as a trade-off, understanding that there may be a challenging moment that could see a brief increase in energy prices, in the price of fuel. But ultimately, this would lead to Iran not having a nuclear weapon that wouldn't just threaten allies across the region like Israel, but also U.S. forces and allies in Europe, and in the future, possibly the United States, given Iran's efforts to increase the range of their ballistic missile program. And so the takeaway here is that the president is patient. And Israeli officials, I spoke with an intelligence official late last week who said that the president's patience is a card that he has at the table with Iran because the Iranians thought that President Trump would back down. And ultimately, he entered into Project Freedom. He was able to block Iran's ports and put new pressure economically on the regime that is forcing the Iranians to respond to these efforts of peace by the Trump administration.
So what would a deal have to entail or include in order for this to be a win and enough for President Trump to end this?
The president has indicated he does not want a partial deal. And so if the Iranian response is only focused on ending the war and looking at the Strait of Hormuz and the traffic through this critical waterway, it's not going to be enough, according to President Trump. He wants to address the nuclear threat from the Iranian regime, and that means getting out the already enriched uranium, what the president refers to as nuclear dust that is buried deep underground in the Operation Midnight Hammer that occurred last summer. That enriched uranium is still there. Also ensuring that the facilities to enrich uranium are dismantled, and then ultimately getting that enriched uranium out of Iran and pledging that the Iranians will never resume a military nuclear program. And these are key agenda items for the Trump administration and its top negotiators, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. We do know over the weekend that Secretary of State Rubio, along with Special Envoy Witkoff, met with the Qatari Prime Minister in Miami. They are working with regional partners to ensure that there is a full-court press, putting this pressure on the Iranian regime, understanding that Iran has two options here, according to President Trump. Either they sign on the dotted line or the war is going to resume.
All right, Trey Yingst,
awesome.
Great
Thanks,
update.
Trey.
Thank you so much for that.
Thanks, buddy.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.